Hello and welcome. This is Amber Rain Davis from NotableInk.com. I'm back with another video with Copic tips for beginners. Now you may be looking at this stamp and thinking, okay, this is definitely not a beginner video, but we're going to break it up into small chunks. Last time we did some smooth surfaces. This time we're going to focus on some hair and skin, but I'll also be giving some tips with the dress as well, and then also the wings, which are more of a transparent item. So I hope you enjoy this video. We're going to be using StampingBella's Edna Needs a Martini stamp set today. First tip right off the bat, this is an excellent line of stamps because StampingBella always has colored artwork on their packaging, and if you're a beginner you can use that to know where your shadows need to go. It is an excellent line of stamps to be able to do that with. I find one of the more challenging things to figure out as a new Copic colorist or a colorist of any media is to figure out where to put the shadows. Now, I stamped this actual image about a year ago because I stamped some extras, and when I colored this for this video, I didn't actually look at the stamp packaging, so you are going to see some differences between my shading and StampingBella's shading. So let's get started. We're going to be using violet for the dress today. So we're going to be using V12 as the lightest shade, V04 as the midtone, and V17 as the darkest shade. So this is going to actually be similar to the coffee cups that I did in my last video. There aren't too many pleats or wrinkles in this dress. You know, Edna is full figured, which I love. And so this dress is actually stretched pretty smooth across her body. So I'm going to use a similar technique that I did on the coffee cups. So I'm going to put down about 2 layers of my lightest shade, which is that V12. And then I'm going to go in with the V04 as my midtone, and I'm going to start mapping out my shadows. This is a nice way to do it. You can also go straight in with your darkest shade if you're confident with where your shadows need to go. I find this makes me a little more comfortable to come in with my midtone. So I'm going to go in maybe about 1 centimeter, maybe less, on the bottom of the skirt, and then just around the edges of the bust and then underneath. So when you're doing this image, again, looking at the package is going to be a huge help. Otherwise, if you don't have that artwork to go with, then you want to think about where the darkest recesses are going to be. So that's going to be anywhere where there's a fold, anywhere where there is something underneath. So you can see like where her legs cross down there, and we'll get to that when we do the skin. Underneath her bust, there's going to be a shadow. On the pleats of her straps on her dress, there's going to be a shadow. You can see where the artist drew in a little dip there. So that's going to be a shadow similar to like what you would see on a flower petal where there's a little dip there. You want to create that little triangle of shadow. Where her dress comes together at the end, I felt like there would be a shadow that runs across right there, like it dips in right there around her knees as well. So I've put darker pigment there. So I did my base layer in the lightest, I mapped out my shadows with the midtones, and then I came in with my darkest shade. You can see that my violet markers are nice and juicy, and so the blending has been pretty easy. So I'm just going to go right over that edge where the midtone and the darkest shade meet, and I'm just going to blend that in. I do like to go over the whole surface. I don't always go all the way out to the edge of the stamp. So even though I'm using a lot of ink and saturating the paper with the ink, I'm not having the colors bleed out because the majority of the ink is in the center of the image. If I were trying to put that much ink down right on the edge of the stamp, then it probably would bleed out. At least at some point it's going to start to bleed out. But the majority of my shading where those colors overlap is closer to the center of the image. So you're less likely to bleed out that way. So I'm just going over those. If there's any harsh edges, you can go over those edges with just small circles. And the V04 tends to wipe out the V12 a little bit. So you can see right here, I put the V17 down, and then when I went over it with the V4, it really kind of wiped out that darkest color. So one of the things you can do is wait for it to dry a little bit. It'll be less likely to blend and lift it up if it's drier, but my inks were still pretty wet, and so you can see it lifted quite a bit of that ink. For the little ruffle down at the bottom, it would be fun, just like on the stamp packaging, to do a contrasting color. I opted to do the same color here, and depending upon what look you're going for, if you go right in with your next shade, your colors are going to blend. So if your ink is still wet, you're going to get more blending. So if you want to have more of a stark difference, or you want some sharp lines in your squiggles that you're doing, and I'm just doing kind of like circular squiggles. I think this is kind of like a tulle edge, kind of like a curly mesh kind of edge is how I'm thinking of it. You can see right here, my colors are blending in quite a bit. The lightest color lifted a lot of my dark up. So I'm going to let that dry a little bit, let those inks dry, and then I'm going to go back in later with some darker colors to add some of that contrast back in and some of that detail back in. So her shoe right there, the shoe in the back, you can see is underneath, so I'm just adding a shadow where those would overlap and cast a shadow. And it's a really small area, so work with your pen fairly vertically so that you can use literally just the tip of the marker there. And they don't need much. They don't need a lot of shading. We're going to start her skin tone with E51 as the lightest, E11 as the midtone, and BV00 as the darkest shade. So I'm going to focus only on the face to start with. So with the skin, I really only do small parts at a time. And that's so I can make sure that I work fast enough. So I'm going to take the E11 and map out my shadows here. So really the hairline is going to cast a shadow on the face. And the face is like a round orb. And I am thinking of my light sources coming straight on, like she's facing us. And so her highlight is going to be somewhat in the center of her face. So now I have the BV00, and I'm going right over those same areas that I mapped out with my midtone. Then once I have my darkest shade down, I'm going to go back in with my midtone and blend that out. So that's the E11. The E11 is going to add a nice warmth to the face, where the BV00 kind of adds that blue cast that the pale skin tones sometimes have. For her lips, you don't have to try and completely avoid them with the skin tone. In fact, lips are going to have a skin tone color underneath them anyhow. So I added a little bit of E04 and then just dotted R37 right at the kind of above and below that line in between her lips. So I'm going to move on to her arm. I think I'm going to do one arm at a time. So the fingers are super, super tiny, so you're not going to use a whole lot of color in those. But I'm going to go ahead and do the 2 layers of the base coat, and then right at the bend of her arm, she's going to have a shadow up against the body because her arm is sitting behind her bust. And then I'm going to do the bottom edge of each of her fingers with just a touch of that mid-tone, and then bringing it up and flicking it up from the elbow there. So I'm going to do the same thing with the B00. I'm not going to extend that out any further than my mid-tone. And then when I come back in with my mid-tone, I'm going to go just a touch further than the BV00. And then I'll go back in with my lightest tone and just blend that completely out. So it's not a lot of shading. This particular fairy I chose a pale skin tone, so there doesn't need to be a ton of shading. There just needs to be the suggestion of the shading there for it to look realistic. So we're going to, again, do the same thing over on this arm. So her strap of her dress would cast a shadow. The bend of her inside of her elbow there would also cast a shadow. The bottom of her arm would be more in shadow. And then again, I'm going to do the bottom of each one of those fingers as well. Be sure to remember to turn your image or your page. Sorry that I'm out of frame a little bit here, but turn your paper in the direction that you're most comfortable flicking. You're going to get a better flick, one with less harshness to it, if you have it in the direction that's most comfortable for you. So definitely remember to do that. I don't always remember to do that. I'm trying to keep it in frame, so I don't always turn my page, but you are going to get better results that way. So you can see the violet bled out a little bit into the shoulder area here. I'm not going to worry too much about it because, again, that's going to be where my shading is. So this time, instead of going in with my mid-tone, I feel like I'm fairly confident about where the shading needs to be. So I'm going straight to my BV00. You will see a difference in shading to how mine is done and to the StampingBella here. I came up and shaded over the bust. I don't know if that's right or wrong. It looks okay to me, so I'm going with it. But in theirs, you can see they really just stayed closer to the corner of the armpit there and then up through the center of the bust. So once I had my BV00 down, I came back in with the E11 and blended that in, and I believe I do a couple coats of that before coming back in with my E50 and blending that out. So again, only needs just a touch. I wanted a little more E11 to warm it up a little. I felt like the face and arms looked a little more peachy compared to her shoulder and bust area. So I'm just warming it up with that E11. All right, and I feel like that looks pretty good. We're going in with this is the E51 or E51. Really, when you're talking about Copics, clearly I'm struggling with this in my video, but the letters and the numbers each mean something separately on their own. So rather than saying E51, I really should be saying E51. So I'm trying to get into the habit of that. So we're doing the same thing here. Sorry, I'm out of frame again. The leg that is behind, there's going to be a shadow casted on it from the leg in front. And then I'm going to go down the edge, and I came in a little bit at that ankle just to give it a little more definition, and then also up through the front edge of the shoe would cast a teeny tiny little shadow onto the leg. And then going back in with the mid-tone, warming up that BV00. Back to the letters and the numbers. The letter just talks about the color family. So E is going to be your earth tones. And the first number talks about the saturation, so the amount of gray that has been added to the color. And then the last number is the brightness or the value. Let's talk about this flower real quick. So I'm putting my base layer of V12 down, and then same thing as I always do, I'm going to go in with my midtone, which in this case is V04, and I'm going to hit those recesses. So on the petals that curl in, it's going to be the top of that petal that is going to have the sunshine or the light on it. And so I'm doing the base of the petals. And then, of course, as you get down deep into the flower, there's going to be more shadow in there as well. This is a really small flower, so you don't need a lot of ink here even to get it to blend. So work with just a little amount of ink, try and blend it out. And then this is a situation where you may go back in and add your darkest color again and not blend it out at all. You may want to just keep that darker contrast there, and it may not need the blending. So I'm going to move on to the wings now. So you're going to see me just test out some of my lightest colors. So I've got RV 000, BG10, and BV00. These still look pretty dark to me on my test sheet here. So I'm using the same paper for my test sheet, and I am going to do some flicks just inside the curves of those wings. I'm also going to do some squiggles in the area. I'm sorry that I'm out of frame again. And I'm going to do just a touch of shading, but I don't know that wings really have shading. So I was kind of playing around with what seems right. This would have been a really good time to pull out the packaging and take a look at what they did. I thought perhaps her body might cast a little bit of a shadow, so I went in there, and then I really didn't like that because even though this is BV00, which is a very light color, it looks really dark to me on the white. So this is where we're going to pull out our zero marker or the colorless blender, and we're going to soften this up. But before I do that, I go in with the RV000 because that's the lightest and has more colorless blender in it than any of these three markers. I'm going to go in, do some squiggles with that to try and soften it up, and now I have my zero colorless blender marker, and I'm just going over all of those areas to soften some of those harsh lines. And I think that turned out pretty well. We're coming down to the home stretch, and we're going to do some hair now. So I chose to do black hair for this little lady, and I'm using C5, C7, C9. You could also throw in a blue tone in there, but I just stuck with the grays for this. And a couple different ways you could do this hair. We talked about it being curly hair. I'm just going to do squiggles all over the hair without any consideration necessarily to the lines that the artist has drawn. What you could do separately to what I did, and I'm doing squiggles. I went up to my next darkest color here, is you could, where those lines are, make sure that you have a darker shadow behind that. So you're building the curls and the dimension of her hair along with the artist lines that they put in. I wanted to keep things really simple. So I started with the C5. I went in and did squiggles all over it. Then I came in with the C7 and did a little bit less squiggles all over. Now I'm going to go in with my C9, and this will have the least amount of squiggles. So it's the darkest color. I'm going to go back and do this pattern over. Obviously, we're trying to get to dark hair, black hair, not gray hair, and so we are going to need to build up the amount of C9 that we have in here. But I don't just right off the bat want to go in and just flood it with a whole bunch of C9 because I don't want it to look flat. I want there to still be some dimension and texture to the hair. We want it to appear curly. So one of the things I think is important for hair is to keep some of the white highlight. The squiggles like this with curly hair kind of lends itself nicely to that because you're not sweeping over the entire surface. So if you noticed, I didn't base this like I normally do. I based it with squiggles. Doing the squiggles is going to inherently leave some of that white space. You can see that I took off the chisel tip cap on my marker, and that is because I don't use C9 very much, so this marker is very full and super juicy. I wanted to avoid getting a big bloop of ink coming out. I could tell that the brush nib was getting very wet because I was using it way up on the tip, and so gravity is going to pull all that ink down to the tip, and so I wanted to avoid a bloop on the paper. The way you do that is to take off the other end, the other cap, and you'll see it suck that ink back up into the canister or barrel. So again, I'm just building the color here. I still want to keep some of those white highlights, but I'm going to, I probably won't go back in with my lightest shade, but I'll go back and forth with my C7, C9 until I get the dark shade that I'm looking for. And I think that turned out nicely. So we are going to move on to the Martini, which I'm going to do as a cosmopolitan because for the longest time, my drink of choice when we would go out with friends would be, I'd order them together, a cosmopolitan and a coffee. I have 3 girls. I've got 3 daughters. Now they're 11, 9, and 8. But particularly when they were really young, if we actually made it out with friends, like I would need a cup of coffee to go with my drink. Otherwise, I'd just find myself falling asleep. So for the longest time, that would be my drink combination, Cosmo and a coffee, which always threw the waiter off, but that was kind of my thing. So I think I'm using 3 colors here. I pulled out an RV52, RV02, and RV04. And you don't need all three. The 5-2 and the 0-2 are pretty close together. I think I was just trying to figure out which one was lighter. Go ahead and base out the Cosmo liquid with one of those lightest colors. Then use the RV04, which I love the name, is Shock Pink. And do your shadows and then go back over it with your lightest color. I used BG10 to do a light base coat on the glass. And then I'm just using, I think that's a C, it's probably a C1 to come in and just put a little shadow on the edges. I think I've got the C3 there. I'll probably go back in, and I'm going over the liquid too because I feel like that would be shaded as well. And then I'll go back in with a little of the lightest color and blend that out. So moving on to the olive, we're going to use G43 and G67. This is so teeny tiny, so you don't need any kind of complicated shading here. Just go ahead and base it out, add a little flick of the darkest green down the edge there. And then for the pimento, I just added a single dot of the, what is the Shock Pink? The RV04 to that, because that's what I had out on my desk. And that's it. You don't need anything more complicated than that. There's so much more going on in the rest of the image that it's not necessary to get too much into the really small parts. So here's where I felt like I wanted some more detail in the ruffle. So I'm casting a shadow from the dress onto the ruffle there with what looks like a C3. I blended that out a little with the C1, and then I'm going back in with my mid-tone, doing some squiggles, and then with my darkest color, or maybe not. I kind of want to go back in with my darkest color now, looking at it, and add some of that, so maybe I'll do that. I'm using the C1 to cast a shadow underneath her shoes. I felt like the card looked empty without that, but I don't think that would actually be happening. I don't think she'd cast a shadow because she's flying around. Maybe she would, I don't know. Maybe it would be further away from her, casted onto the floor because she's flying around and not actually touching the surface. I think that would probably be more accurate, but it's a card, so we're going with it. I'm going to stamp a sentiment here, and this stamp is actually from a different StampingBella set that I have that also includes a Cosmo or a Martini. I'm going to frame it with a purple piece of cardstock, put a purple piece of fun foam behind that to pop it up on my card base, and then I'm going to finish off the card with some tiny little star sequins and also some Wink of Stella all over the dress, the wings, the hair. I put some on the glass as well, and the card will be done. It's sometimes easier to see the sparkle on video, so I wanted you to be able to see all the areas that were sparkling. I have a sequin up by her rose, but you can't really see the triangle that it's making, so I didn't love the placement of my sequins. Here's a close-up of the sparkle and the wings, so you can see how those turned out. I really enjoyed making this card and how this turned out. You let me know below if this was just way too advanced for beginner, or if you felt like you did pick up some tips from it that you can use as a beginner. The thing to remember is this is just paper. So, you know, get out there, practice, kind of put some of these techniques to the test, find out what color combinations work for you, using the markers that you have, and let me know down in the comments if you would like something different. Was this too advanced? Was this just right the way that it was broken up into the bite-sized pieces? Or just definitely too long? This is a longer video than I normally do. Thank you so much for stopping by. Please subscribe to my channel to see more videos, to my blog, and also to my Instagram account where I do giveaways and then also post more photos of cards that I've done that I may not be blogging about or doing video tutorials. Have a great day.